Okay, folks, so in this video, I'm going to go through the second ecology handout that we have. All right. Looking in this video in particular at the factors that we were discussing at the end of the last video, abiotic factors and biotic factors. And these are the living and non-living factors that can affect organisms living within a habitat. Okay. So now, in any exam, you need to be able to describe what is a biotic factor, what is an abiotic factor. You need to be able to give examples of them within within an example of an ecosystem. Okay. Ideally, try and use an Irish ecosystem example. Okay, but you need to be able to explain what they mean. Okay, so first of all, looking at abiotic factors. Okay, so to remind us all, abiotic factors are what we call non-living factors. Okay, so these are factors which can affect an organism. All right, affect the habitat and the organisms within a habitat, but don't involve other living organisms themselves. All right, so there's three main types of abiotic factors that you need to know for your course. The first one is weather. Okay, so weather and temperature, major impact on a habitat. Low levels of precipitation, which is the correct technical term for rainfall, so low levels of precipitation or rainfall creates an arid or dry habitat, such as the Australian outback and deserts. High precipitation can lead to boggy marshlands, such as found in places like Ireland, or if it's extremely high levels of precipitation, you can get jungle. All right. So temperature is also a factor when we talk about weather. All right. So habitats that experience a very low temperature, such as the tundras of the Arctic regions, are going to be very different to the sunny tropics of the jungles. Light intensity and humidity will also influence a habitat. So the greater the level of sunlight or light intensity, the more plants will grow. All right. This is why if you looked at a map of the world, all the jungles of the world grow in and around the equator because that's the part of the world that gets the most sunlight. Okay, you're not going to see jungles very far north or very far south because those areas of the planet get less sunlight. Okay, higher levels of humidity will lead to adaptations in plants. However, so the stomata, which are tiny little holes on the underside of a leaf, which allow excess water to be given out. The stomata of jungle plants actually have structures on them that actively pump water out of the plant. Unlike, say, plants in Ireland that just use evaporation to get rid of excess water. And one other thing which I haven't mentioned here, written here, but I'll mention now, wind, of course. Wind is a factor, okay? Very windy areas that experience lots of high levels of wind will have less plant growth than areas that get less wind because strong winds make it more difficult for plants to grow. So the next of our three major non-living or abiotic factors is soil or soil type. Now, this is actually one of the biggest factors in determining the type of habitat that can develop in an area. All right, if you have very dry soil that cannot retain water well, it's going to be a very dry, arid landscape. If you have softer soil that can store lots of water, if there's the correct levels of rainfall, you're more likely to get boggy or marshy land. If you have lots of rainfall but a dry soil type, you still have dry soil and a dry habitat. Okay, so however, when we talk about soil, what we're talking about mostly is pH, which is the acidity of the soil, and moisture as well to a degree, both of which will greatly affect the type of plant that can grow. Centuries ago, Ireland was covered in forests. Okay, it was said at one point, if you go back, say 400 years ago, they said that a squirrel could travel from the east coast of Ireland to the west coast of Ireland, having never to touch the ground. Okay, that's how dense the forests were. Now, there are two main types of forest in Ireland. The first was a forest predominantly made up of ash trees and elm trees. Okay, and then the second type of forest was one that was mostly made up of oak trees. Okay, and you had these two distinctive different types of forests in Ireland. Okay, but why were they these two different types of forests in Ireland? It had to do with the soil pH. Okay, oak trees can be found growing in soil of approximately 4.5, okay, pH. Okay, now this is fairly acidic soil, okay? So a pH of 4.5 is not quite as acidic as, say, lemon juice, but it's still pretty acidic, okay? Ash elm woodlands like to grow in soil with a pH closer to 6, so it's much closer to neutral. So these differences in pH of soil led to two different types of forests in Ireland. And another factor in soil is the moisture in the soil. Soil which stores a lot of moisture can allow different plants to grow in it. In the cases of soil which is saturated in water, the habitat will be a bog or marsh. And soil which has very little moisture, you'll find cactuses and similar plants growing in them. Okay? And finally, we get to the type of landscape. So the type of landscape refers to physical features in the landscape of a habitat. So if the habitat is a hill or slope, would be one thing, okay? And if it's a slope, which direction does it face? North-facing slopes will have a lower light intensity than south-facing slopes because of the way the sun moves across the sky. All right, if it's and then it's flipped in the southern hemisphere, a north-facing slope gets more sun, and a south-facing slope doesn't. Obviously, more sunlight means more plant growth and more heat. Now let's look at our biotic factors in more detail. So biotic factors are living factors, so the impact of one organism on another. So first we have competition, which is the struggle between various organisms for essential resources or things that would be in limited supply. So examples of such resources or limited supply things would be food, space or shelter in which to live, oxygen and water habitats especially, water, light, and mates for reproduction. So competition can take place between two or more organisms of the same species or organisms of different species. Obviously, two organisms of different species are not going to be competing for mates, but they could be competing for food, for shelter, for space. Okay? Over time, organisms will develop advantages over other organisms to allow them to compete better for resources. These advantages will be the results of random mutations which occur, such as being slightly stronger, bigger, or faster than another organism. These slightly more successful organisms will then be able to do better, live longer, and have more offspring, which carry these advantageous traits. And over time, this results in the development of new species of organisms. This can be in response to, this response to competition is basically the fundamental basis of evolution. Or new organisms evolve because of competition. So, I just found another typo. Good thing I'm going over this. By the way, this handout will be given out in Google Classroom shortly. So, next we get predation. Now, this is fairly simple. It refers to the hunting of some organisms by others. It's quite straightforward. Organisms which do the hunting is a predator, and the organism being hunted is the prey. Okay, so this is actually important though is that predation allows for a balance. All right, when you have predators, they will stop another organism's numbers from getting out of control. So an example where predation has failed to occur in Ireland would be deer. So wild deer populations around the country have no natural predators. This because the natural predators that they used to have, the wolf, was hunted into an extinction in Ireland over 200 years ago. Because there's no longer any wolves in Ireland, there's nothing to keep the numbers of deer in check. So every couple of years in different parts of the country, park rangers have to go out and actually cull the herds of deer. So they will hunt and kill large numbers of deer. Now they make sure to do this outside of mating seasons and at times of the year when the deer would have young. And they do it at the time of the year when the young would be old enough that they've left the mother. And they will try to actively hunt and kill older looking deer, male or female, that are older and weaker and sicker. If there was a natural predator in Ireland like the wolf, well, they would be doing that for us naturally. Wolves would be hunting the oldest, weakest members of a herd and culling their numbers so that their numbers never get out of control. They'll never hunt down all the deer, but they keep things in check and there's a balance. All right? And that balance is a big part of why predation is a biotic or living factor. Next, we get to symbiosis. All right. Now, symbiosis was not discussed in the previous handout. We're discussing it now. It is the scientific term for a relationship that develops between different species of organisms in which at least one of those organisms benefits from the relationship. An example of mutually beneficial relationship can be found in certain bacteria called rhizobia, which are what are known as nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So nitrogen fixation is an important part of the nitrogen cycle in which bacteria such as the rhizobia take nitrogen gas that's in the air that we're breathing in all the time but does nothing for us, which the plant can't use because it's in its gas form. But they take that nitrogen gas out of the air and turn it into ammonia, which is an essential fertilizer for plants. And the plants can then use that ammonia, okay? The rhizobia bacteria that do this actually are living in the root structures of certain plants, for example, the legumes of the pea family, okay? So these bacteria have gone inside the plant, living in the roots, all right? And then when they absorb nitrogen gas from the air and turn it into ammonia, because they're inside the plant can now get at that ammonia, all right, which benefits it directly. The plant there is providing a home for the bacteria and also feeding it with certain the sugars that it produces from photosynthesis, the bacteria can use, okay? And the bacteria provides the plant with these essential ammonia nutrients through the process of nitrogen fixation. Another simple example of symbiosis would be the oxpecker bird. These are the tiny little birds that you see on nature documentaries that sit in the mouths of hippos and pick at them. What those birds are actually doing is picking at food that's stuck in the gums and in the teeth of the hippo. And by doing that, they're cleaning the hippo's teeth. If those birds were not doing that, that bits of food stuck in the hippo's teeth would cause tooth decay, which would cause their teeth to rot and fall out, or in worst cases, get abscesses and infections that could kill the animal. Obviously, the hippo is not eating the bird, they eat other things, and the bird helps them out. So these are examples of symbiosis, mutually beneficial relationships, okay, in which neither organism is harmed, okay? Examples of relationship where the relationship is harmful to one of the organisms would be a parasitic relationship, okay? A simple example of a parasitic relationship would be fleas on a dog or a cat. The dog or the cat in no way benefits from fleas living on it. The fleas are surviving on the host animal by drinking their blood, all right? Next, we get to the topic of interdependent. And this is a very important one, and we're going to talk about this for a few minutes and then leave it there. So interdependence is a scientific term used to describe relationships between different organisms in which the relationship is crucial for the survival of both. That means without this relationship, both organisms would die. This is very important in the topic of biodiversity. And as we have seen many times, especially over the last 20, 30 years, as ecologists grow to understand nature better, when you start seeing one set of organisms in an ecosystem die, the entire ecosystem can be suffering because there could be interdependent relationships between various organisms in that ecosystem. And as one dies, the other dies. An example of an interdependent relationship is a relationship between flowering plants and pollinating insects such as the bee, which I mentioned in the last video. So in order for a flowering plant to reproduce, they must transport the pollen from their flower into the flower of another plant. The pollen is basically the sex cell of the plant, okay? Plants, of course, are unable to move to transfer this pollen, so the method used by flowering plants is pollinating insects such as the bee. So the whole reason that the plant has made these flower structures is to attract bees. The bee travels into the flower, it climbs down to the bottom of the flower where the nectar that the flower produces is. Nectar is a sugary syrup, okay, that the bee eats, okay, and is the primary food for the bee and is what the bee uses to make the honey in the hive. Now, as it's climbing down to the bottom of the flower, it's getting covered in pollen. It then flies out of that flower and goes to a flower of another plant of the same species, crawls down to that one and gets more nectar. The pollen that it had on itself from the first flower falls off onto the second flower, and the pollen from the second flower falls onto the bee and gets transported along. The pollen that fell off the bee onto this second flower lands and then allows sexual reproduction to occur. As I said, the pollen is actually a sex cell, like a sperm effectively, and it can travel down through the flower structure, fertilize the eggs at the base of the flower, and they will eventually develop into seeds and into fruit. Okay? Without pollinators like bees and similar insects transferring this pollen, those flowers would never reproduce, and the plants would go extinct, which is obviously a massively important thing. We need to protect the species as often as we can, but also for purely selfish reasons affects us, because the fruits that these plants produce are the fruits that we eat. Apples and so forth. Any fruit that you get in a shop is made in this process, okay? Across the planet, the number of bees is going down as their hives are dying. We're not exactly sure why this is, but if bees continue to die and become extinct, approximately 80% of all flowering plants on the planet will no longer be able to reproduce and will risk going extinct. That could result in a decrease of up to 15% of the foods that we eat every day. This relationship between different organisms in which the relationship is essential to survival of one or both is an example of interdependence. So there are some questions at the end of this. I'd like you to read through this, take your time, read the questions, and then resubmit them to me for correction. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.